Hello and welcome to this revision video on the early modern section of crime and punishment. So there's a little bit of background we need to think about what life was like in early modern England and how things changed and how that may have affected crime, law enforcement and punishment. Most people still live in the same way. The vast majority of the population are peasant farmers, live in rural communities, small communities in the countryside. Famine and disease that plagued people's lives during the medieval period remain in the early modern period, particularly in the 1500s. Disease and famine is a real problem. The British Empire sees its origins in this time period in the early 17th century, and as a consequence, trade grows, so products coming into the country from all across the world. More roads are built too, connecting the country up. People begin to travel more commonly and for greater distances. And the printing press is also created, so texts can be recreated much more quickly. This allows ideas and information to spread. Furthermore, a group of very strict Christians, known as the Puritans, became very influential. They began to run towns and villages, as well as eventually running the whole country after the English Civil War and the replacement of the monarchy with Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan government. The population also almost doubles in the 16th century from 2.4 to 4.1 million people. And the government itself also becomes much more powerful as power is taken away from the monarch and is given instead to Parliament, which is dominated by wealthy landowning MPs. So what types of crimes were a big problem in early modern England? The first one is vagrancy. With the dramatic increase in population, as well as poor harvests and rising prices, more and more people wander from place to place looking for work. In this time period, people were very fearful of vagrants, and particularly because of this book. There's a page on the screen from this book, Thomas Harmon's book about vagrants. People had a great fear of them, or worried about these people arriving in their communities. In reality, most vagrants were just desperate people who were starving in their own community, so they leave looking for a better life. Second big area of crime is moral crime, and also witchcraft is linked to that. This goes back to the influence of the Puritans, these really strict Christians. People also believe in magic and the devil to explain away difficult things that happen in their life, to explain away disease, to explain away bad luck, to explain away poor harvests. They don't have the scientific knowledge and understanding that we have today. The church, just like in medieval times, is particularly concerned with moral crime, particularly in early modern times. They're against sex outside marriage, but anything including things like working on Sundays, gambling, prostitution, all of those things would be seen as moral crimes, crimes against God and his teachings. So consequently, witchcraft becomes more of a concern in this time period. Again, lack of scientific understanding. Usually it's older widowed women that are targeted, and they're accused after some kind of dispute or argument. Often witches, or people who became accused as witches, were people who could give out cures and give out medicines to people who were sick. When that doesn't work, because they don't have the scientific understanding that we do today, people start to blame them. So if you went to get a medicine from a witch for your child who was sick, a few days later after taking the medicine the child dies, you accuse the witch of putting a spell or a curse on the child, when in reality it's just that the cure hasn't worked and the child was always going to die anyway. Another major crime in this time, and a new type of crime, is smuggling. As I mentioned at the start, this is an era of growing trade, loads and loads of new products coming into Britain from across the world, things like sugar, tobacco, tea, coffee, all of these types of things are new products arriving into Britain in this time. The government saw this as an opportunity to raise taxes on imported products brought into Britain, and they were raised by 30% in 1720. So whatever the price of the product you were going to buy from overseas, so say we're going to buy sugar that was brought into Britain, whatever the price that would sell for was raised by 30% because the government took taxes. So the smugglers bring lots of these expensive products into the country, and unsurprisingly, lots of local people support and help the smugglers. They resent the government, they dislike the taxes that the government are charging, and of course they want cheaper products as well. So locals often help the smugglers hide and disguise products. The smugglers would go out in small boats across to France or the Netherlands, bring products back, arrive on the coast in Britain, and the local people would help hide things in caves and coves on the coast away from the authorities. Another type of crime that becomes commonplace in the early modern period is highway robbery. These were violent robberies, attacks on people travelling in carriages and horse and cart. Often people are travelling in rural, remote, unlit roads, so places where there isn't anybody around. If you're completely defenceless, really, if you're stopped. These robbers would jump out at people with guns, point them at them, and threaten their lives. They knew that wealthy people, when they were travelling, often carried their valuables with them. There was no banks or safes or vaults in this time, so if you left your expensive products at home or expensive goods at home, they were at risk of being stolen and burgled. Highwaymen were often portrayed as romantically in a positive way, as kind of almost like roguish heroes, but in reality they were actually just violent thugs. They used extreme violence and force against their victims to steal from them. Okay, so our next part of the early modern period to look at is law enforcement. So let's see what continues in the same way as medieval times. So lots of continuities, things that don't really change. So still no police force. That's going to appear in the next time period. So communities are still responsible for policing themselves. The best thing they can do to alert people to a crime being committed is use the hue and cry, that alarm system, that warning system where people are expected to shout out. Officials are still unpaid and untrained, and they're the people in charge of enforcing the law. So justice of the peace, parish constables, chief constables, church wardens, it's still the same people. They pocket the money collected from fines, the status they get, the authority they get, that's their reward for doing this, rather than an actual salary or pay. Despite this, there are some changes to law enforcement as well. Towns are growing in this time period, so we get more and more night watchmen. Some types of courts become less important. Sheriffs, manor courts, and church courts become less important. Manor courts become less important because fewer people are living on the lord of the manor's land. More and more people are freemen who live in towns who don't, who are not controlled by a lord of the manor. Church courts become less important, largely because of puritanical influence. So other courts take up church courts' work. So particularly things like moral crime and witchcraft, other courts become interested in those because of the climate of the day, because of the growth of the Puritans. Justice of the peace became more important in this time period, and they dealt with a lot of crime. They run quarter sessions, so court sessions 4 times a year. But because of the sheer amount of crime that was committed and the growing population, they had to do overspill sessions called petty sessions to mop up any additional cases. So courts in the early modern period, we've got a few different ones. We've got the county assize. This is the most powerful court. These assize courts were courts that appeared at various different times in the year in different areas. They were managed or ran by judges from the Royal Court in London. So judges from the Royal Court travelled around the country and travelled to each part of the country twice per year on circuits, and they ran these county assizes for the most serious crimes. As I say, quarter sessions ran by Justice of the Peace, they deal with day-to-day crimes, thefts and assaults, things that affect people on a day-to-day basis. Petty sessions then for any additional cases that overspill. Manor courts do still exist, but as I say, are less important now as fewer and fewer people live on somebody else's land, on the Lord of the Manor's land. And church courts as well. They still exist, but again are less important, largely because of the growing influence of the Puritans in regular courts. Law enforcers in this time period, well, what do we know about them? Well, they often knew the criminals they were charging, they were known to them, they lived near them, they knew their families. In this time, it became more common for the wealthy to start reporting on the poor. And local people were incredibly important in reporting crimes, reporting it to the justice of the peace. And they often give evidence in trials, things that they say they have seen or witnessed, and their testimonies, their words in court become exceptionally powerful, particularly in crimes such as witchcraft. Somebody could be sentenced to death off the basis of somebody else's testimony. So somebody could explain in court the supposed spells or elements of witchcraft that a woman had committed, and they could end up executed based on the word of somebody else. Again, our final section is early modern punishments. So quite a lot of similarities here in this first bit to the medieval times. Public humiliation is a major form of punishment. So things like public confessions, stocks, pillory, cooking stool, ducking stool, scold's bridle, very similar to medieval times. Physical punishments too still exist. Branding, whipping, again done publicly. Prisons remain rare and really only for debtors, people who are in debt, who can't afford to pay a fine they've been given or owe money. So prisons remain rare. Conditions are awful in early modern prisons. It's really just sort of a cellar or a room. Prisoners are chained to the wall. They're not fed. They're not given water. They're not given blankets. If they want any of those things, they have to buy them themselves. So you often see people sat outside a prison in early modern times, chained to the wall, begging for charity. One big change though that does occur in this time is the introduction of bridewells. So bridewells were buildings where usually vagrants, but other criminals too, were placed, and they were put there and made to work. Okay, so they were housed and fed, but they were made to work inside it. This is in response to vagrancy and growing populations, that there just simply was too many people that needed looking after, or too many people committing petty crimes. So bridewells become created. The first one in London was in a former royal palace, but other ones could be placed in things like city walls and city gates, disused castles, just anywhere where you could house lots of people. And finally, our last thing to look at in the early modern period is the Bloody Code. So the Bloody Code was introduced in 1688, and what the Bloody Code did was it increased the number of capital offences, so crimes that you could be executed for, and it increases them from 50 crimes before 1688 to 200 after the introduction of the Bloody Code. Part of the reason for this is who is now running the country, who's in charge. MPs in Parliament are able to vote and change the law. They are often wealthy landowners who are fearful of crime, who are fearful of crimes and attacks on their property and attacks on their estates and their land. The idea of the Bloody Code was that if you made the punishment so harsh, it would scare people to prevent them committing crime. It would completely put them off. It would deter them. Some of the things that become capital crimes then in this time period are things like poaching, so stealing animals, going onto someone else's land and killing and stealing animals, cutting fences, wearing blackface paint to hide yourself if you're on somebody else's land illegally, trespassing. All of these things could get you executed. As you can see, they're crimes against somebody else's property. It's what the wealthy landowners would fear. However, despite this, the number of hangings actually fell in this time period. Juries did not want to execute people. Juries were sympathetic to the people who committed these crimes. They didn't think it was fair to have somebody hanged for cutting a fence down, or going and fishing illegally, or going and poaching and shooting a rabbit. They recognised the challenges and the difficulties that people face on a day-to-day basis just to survive.